The Bible never mentions purgatory. Not once. Not in the original Hebrew, not in the Greek. The word does not exist in 66 books of Scripture. If you were raised believing your loved ones are somewhere being made ready for heaven, that belief is carrying something real, grief and hope both. Tonight, the Hebrew text will ask you where that belief actually came from. We are doing three things. First, we examine the Hebrew word for the realm of the dead and show what it means. Second, we trace how a concept outside the Bible entered Christian teaching as though it had always been there. Third, we look at what the text actually says about the dead. The text will speak for itself. What if one of Christianity's most famous afterlife doctrines cannot be found in the Bible? And hidden in a single Hebrew word near the end of this video is the reason the textual case begins to unravel. Picture a Roman church in the 4th century. A priest reading from a Latin Bible, not Hebrew, not Greek, from a translation. One Greek word rendered in a way that opened the door to entirely different theological conclusions, translation choices, centuries of development, church councils, and eventually what billions came to believe about the dead. Most people assume purgatory is somewhere in the Bible, maybe in a dark passage about the underworld, maybe in Paul, maybe in Revelation. The assumption is this is ancient, this is biblical, this is what the church has always believed. If someone you loved died and you were not sure they were ready, you wanted somewhere for them to go. Not hell, not heaven yet, somewhere between. That longing is human, but was the Bible the source of it? Sheol. It appears 66 times in the Old Testament. Every major English translation renders it differently. Grave, hell, depths, pit. Not once does Sheol carry the idea of purification. It is simply the place where the dead go. The lexical evidence is specific. Purgatory never appears in the Bible. The concept of post-death purification before heaven is not in the 66 Protestant books. The passages cited, 1 Corinthians 3:15, Matthew 5:26, and 2 Maccabees 12:46, either belong outside the canon or carry meanings pointing elsewhere. Now let us examine each. The standard argument draws on three sources: 2 Maccabees 12:46 about praying for the dead, 1 Corinthians 3:15, Paul's reference to being saved through fire, and Matthew 5:26, not coming out until the last penny is paid. These are real texts with serious scholarly support for over 1,000 years. But what do the original words actually carry? In 1 Corinthians 3:15, Paul uses pur, fire. He describes how a person's work will be tested on Judgment Day. If it burns, the person is still saved as through fire. The image is not purification after death. It is escape from a burning building. The fire tests on the final day, not a process in an intermediate state. The Greek is hos dia puros, as through fire. Hos means as if or like. It is a simile. Paul is not describing a place, but a close escape. Walter Bauer's Greek-English lexicon treats this as comparative, a manner of speaking, not a literal post-mortem state. Read it again in English and you will see why this detail disappears in translation. Have you ever read a verse feeling it meant something, only to learn you were reading a conclusion already in your mind? That is what happens when doctrine forms first, then returns to the text to find support. Sheol appears in Genesis 37:35 when Jacob says he will go down to Sheol mourning. In Job 14:13, Job asks God to hide him in Sheol. Psalm 139:8, "If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there." Jonah 2:2, Jonah from the belly of the fish calls it Sheol. Sheol carries no moral evaluation. It is not for the wicked or righteous. It is the place for the dead. R. Laird Harris in the Theological Word Book describes Sheol as the common destination with no distinction between righteous and wicked. No purifying process, no movement toward anything. No purification, no progression, no language of post-mortem refinement. You might expect Sheol to function like purgatory, a transitional space. But look at the Hebrew. Sheol never carries a verb of purification, refining, or release. It carries verbs of descent, silence, and waiting. The transitional reading is not supported by the lexical data. The actual Greek word for purgatory, katharterion, does not appear in the New Testament. A Catholic theologian would rightly note the doctrine never depended on that specific word, but on theological inference from passages like 1 Corinthians 3 and Matthew 5. That is fair. The word's absence is not the entire argument. But chronology shows something significant. Ideas of post-death purification appear in Christian writings centuries after the New Testament. The doctrine was formally defined at the Council of Florence in 1439 and reaffirmed at Trent in 1563. Developed across serious theological reflection, undeniably. But that distance itself matters for anyone asking, did this come from the text or come to the text? 2 Maccabees was not part of the Hebrew canon that became the Jewish Bible. When reformers returned to the Hebrew canon in the 16th century, the strongest direct textual case for prayers for the dead fell outside their authoritative text. This is where history and text diverge. In Eden, death enters as consequence of separation from God. No intermediate state, only the warning, on that day you will surely die. Immediate rupture, no graded process. Israel understood death through Sheol. The dead descend. They are cut off from praise. Psalm 6:5. In death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? The Old Testament presents Sheol not as progress, but as a waiting. Then comes the incarnation, and everything shifts. Jesus does not introduce purgatory, he introduces resurrection. The New Testament's answer to Sheol is not purification, but the empty tomb. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4 does not describe the dead going through a process, but being raised at the sound of a trumpet. The movement is not from impurity to purity through fire, but from death to life through resurrection. Someone watching has spent years praying for a loved one they believed was still undergoing a process beyond death. That prayer was real. That grief was real. What the Hebrew shows does not dishonor that love. It simply asks, did the Bible ever promise them a waiting room? And what it offers instead may be more radical. Not a process, but a person. Not purification by fire, but resurrection by grace. This is not abstract theology. This is a man at a grave, asking whether the text tells the truth about what is on the other side. And here it is in the Hebrew. Right here is what almost no English reader sees, because it lives in the letters themselves. KAPHAR, to cover, to atone, to make propitiation. This is the word behind Israel's sacrificial system and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Here is what the Hebrew shows. Atonement was not a process the individual undergoes. It was an act performed by a priest on behalf of the people in the present moment through blood. The direction is always outward, from priest toward worshiper. The covering comes to them. They do not climb toward it. The strongest Catholic response deserves honesty. Catholic theology says, KAPHAR is precisely what makes purgatory possible. Christ's atonement is complete. Purgatory is about receiving it fully, not earning it. The suffering is not punishment added to what Christ did, but the final gracious removal of imperfection, made possible entirely by Christ's merits. The priest has acted. Purgatory is the worshiper being fully clothed in what was provided. That is the strongest argument, and it is serious. But here is where Hebrew structure creates tension with it. In the sacrificial system, the covering was not applied gradually. It was declared complete. The worshiper left the altar not partially covered, but fully. KAPHAR's logic is not a process the recipient moves through, but a verdict rendered over them. When Hebrews 9:12 picks up this language, he entered once for all into the holy places by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. The word is aionios, permanent, unrepeatable. The writer makes a deliberate lexical argument. This KAPHAR differs from the Levitical system because it does not need repeating. Not annually, not after death, not at all. The hidden insight, the Hebrew word for atonement, was never what the individual does in suffering. It was always what the priest does in grace. Whether that grace is applied instantly or across a longer process is where traditions genuinely disagree. But the direction, outward, complete, given, is consistent from Leviticus to Hebrews. If KAPHAR carries the idea of a covering provided by another, received rather than earned, declared rather than gradually acquired, what does that change about your standing before God? Tell me in the comments. The question from the beginning was whether purgatory came from Scripture or was later read back in. The lexical evidence suggests the word does not appear. Sheol carries no meaning of purification. The Greek passages cited do not straightforwardly describe a post-mortem intermediate state. And KAPHAR consistently points toward a covering provided by grace, given completely, in the direction from priest to people. One final Hebrew observation. Shalom, from shalom, meaning completeness, wholeness, nothing missing. The New Testament's final image of the redeemed is not people gradually made ready, but people clothed in righteousness, not their own. The Hebrew vision has always been this, not purification by fire, but shalom, completeness given. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. Hebrews 10:14. The question at the beginning was whether the Bible ever gave that longing a name and a location. The Hebrew text gave it neither. What it gave instead was a covering. Perhaps now you know who said, "It is finished"?